Excellent. Let's do it.
So welcome to the Idealist Society of North America's second event for our spring series. Today, we're extremely happy to have Ben Woodard here to speak. Just before we begin, I just wanted to introduce who we are and what we all are about before I introduce who Ben is. So the Idealist Society of North America is an international group of academics and scholars and researchers dedicated to cultivating a space to the study of idealist philosophy, broadly construed. Our mission is to intertwine the wider tradition of idealism from Plato to the present with this tradition's instantiation in the fields of 18th and 19th century German idealism, along with 19th and 20th century British and American idealism. We view these movements as particular important moments in the idealist tradition, but seek to establish the broader continuity of these moments with the idealist tradition as a whole. And we are committed to no single definition of idealism, but instead embrace the vicissitudes of the idealist tradition in full to advance research into the idealist tradition and its most prominent proponents. So my name is Christopher Satur. I'm a part of the executive committee, joined by Benjamin Norris and Paulo Camparisi. Unfortunately, our fourth member of our committee, Yasmin Uzil, couldn't make it with us today, but she's here in spirit. So for today's talk, we have a very gifted philosopher, Ben Woodard. And the rundown for the talk is, historically, F.H. Bradley's logic has been claimed by both coherence and identity theorists. However, by taking seriously Bradley's metaphysical work, which many commentators attempt to separate from the logical work, Ben Woodard argues that the very form of transcendental logic, as Bradley reads it, cannot be separated from metaphysics, given the explanatory role he gives to appearance. Woodard argues for an affinity between Bradley's metaphysical system and that of Wilfrid Sellars. While both Sellars and Bradley attach the capacities of logic to sense, the role of feeling in Bradley as leading towards a collective practice complicates the status of transcendental psychology to which Sellars adheres to. So Dr. Ben Woodard is a postdoctoral researcher at Leuphana University in Nuremberg, Germany. And currently, Dr. Woodard is currently writing a book on nature philosophy, romantic science, and formalism entitled Nature Itself Philosophizes. I think I have the, sorry, 1 second. I apologize for that. Just give me 1 second. I have read, unfortunately, I apologize, Ben. I've read the wrong bio. So Ben Woodard is currently a research fellow at the Institute of Cultural Inquiry in Berlin, Germany. And his work focuses on the relationship between naturalism and idealism in the long 19th century. So his fourth monograph on uninhabited science, fiction, and decolonial will be published in 2023 by Zero Books. So I'm welcoming Ben Woodard to our event, and you now have the floor, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, Chris and Paulo and Ben and everyone else who has helped put the society together. It's very surprising, nice surprise, but also strange to be asked to talk about Bradley. It's been a very sort of writing on Bradley. You had to sort of convince people it was something worth reading, even among other academics at times. So I'll sort of want to talk about this question of qualities and relations, and in particular, because I think it's the place where Bradley and Sellars are most, they're the closest. And I think part of the point of that, hopefully, is that it's about sort of opening up what counts as idealism and the sort of working against this opposition of idealism and realism, and also against this caricature of idealism which persists, especially from the analytic continental split. So I'll just hopefully try to make some sense of that. And I apologize if I try to find a balance between introducing Bradley and sort of talking about the interesting parts of Bradley, because of course, even among idealists, it's hard to know who's actually read anything by Bradley. Generally, I assume no one has, which in this case, maybe it's a few, but yeah, that's, yeah, so with that, sorry, actually, I don't have the ability to share my screen. Can I get that from somebody who's a host?
Yes, sorry. I think we have to just make you a.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
We got you.
That's good, thank you. Okay. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this. Can see the slides? Okay. Right, so to start this idea, the title, which is maybe a bit silly, of course, this idea of the coloring book of the world, the notion there is that it's sort of pushing against or complicating this idea, especially again in analytic or certain rational philosophies, that one can write the book of the world, right? And so in the case of someone like Bradley, and I think Sellars is sympathetic to this, there's no writing the book of the world. Instead, there's only sort of filling in, there's a sort of experiential and a sort of vague or fuzzy aspect, which can't really be denied. So it's much more about sort of filling in things than necessarily writing things in a kind of straightforward manner. So I should just say what I'm going to talk about, it's the third chapter of a book which I wrote as part of my habilitation schrift. So in Germany, you have to write a second dissertation, sort of, in order to be able to teach. That's how things work here. So my habilitation text was on the analytic continental divide, and specifically on the work of Bradley. And I didn't really intend to write about Bradley, actually. I was doing a history of idealism. I wanted to sort of fill in the blanks and talk about the idealist thinkers and periods that I didn't know as well. And so, because I worked mostly on post-Kantian idealism, especially Schelling, I didn't know anything about British idealism, so I sort of started going into that, and I got completely sort of trapped by Bradley and ended up reading everything he wrote and kind of getting a little bit obsessed with him and writing my habilitation on him in the end. But of course, part of this was also the fact that that I was also working on this project with a friend about trying to look at the details of the analytic continental divide and how that divide emerged, right? So I think it's typical that the analytic continental divide is looked sort of a few decades after it sort of happened with Heidegger and Davos and these kinds of things, or Husserl or whatever, Frege. And so we wanted to look at the sort of the real beginning of it. And so that kind of coincided with looking at Bradley. And so, yeah, this chapter, or the sort of goal of the book, was to look at the analytic continental divide, and also try to make that divide and the legacy of the divide relevant for contemporary problems in philosophy, and not just make it a historical sort of adventure. And so, so this is why this text is sort of about Sellars, because Sellars has kind of undergone a bit of a extensive re-examination, and Sellars and Bradley have some interesting affinities. So just to do the kind of the sort of basic stuff about Bradley, or some of the basic things about him. In terms of historiography, he's a very complicated figure because there's some typical stories and some less known things. So of course, F.H. Bradley, his work is seen, and he as a figure is seen as a sort of capstone or the apex of British idealism. And even what British idealism means, most people often haven't even heard of it. It's sort of a historically obscure period, I think, for a lot of people. But so there's a range of figures, of course. There's Bradley, there's T.H. Green, there's Bosanquet, Joachim. But I think the thing that sort of unites them is they have this idea of a sort of non-naive concept of empiricism, or what we might call experience, right? But of course, how they pursue that is quite different. if you look at the analytic stuff, for sort of the analytic history, they'll say, oh, these are like some British thinkers who are sort of contaminated by, European thought, whatever that means. And of course, that history getting retold after the World Wars takes on a different valence, obviously. But the way in which Green or Bradley and various people took on this sort of rewriting of empiricism was actually part of a transnational problem. And again, I think in terms of historiography, it's a bit obscured and it's not well studied anymore, at least in terms of modern philosophy courses, that this period, really the sort of mid 1800s until the early 1900s, is really about sort of resetting the boundaries of metaphysics, resetting the boundaries of ontology, especially in regards to developments in science, and really in response to psychology, right? So it's no coincidence that if you look at, wise people as different as James, Bergson, Helmholtz, de Bois-Reymond, and someone like Bradley are all concerned about psychology in a significant way. And so it's in a sense, it's about what is the difference between philosophy and psychology. If we put the mind into the world, how do we reset the mind-world relation, right? And there's lots of instances of that, post-Darwinian responses, psychological responses. So it's a general trend, and British idealism is part of that kind of prehistory. The other sort of thing that's complicated about Bradley and with the British idealists is how much they can be seen as being sort of post-Kantian influenced by post-Kantian thought. And it's not at all straightforward, the ways in which they are. So again, a lot of the typical texts on Bradley will say he's a Hegelian, right? But if you read Bradley, if you read even, if you read some of the most famous passages, you would immediately be surprised that anyone calls him Hegelian. He is very sympathetic to parts of the phenomenology. He's mostly sympathetic to the philosophy of mind, actually, though he doesn't say this explicitly very often. He's not so sympathetic to the logic, especially when he writes Appearance and Reality. He has some issues with certain aspects of Hegel's logic, for instance. At the same time, Bradley is sympathetic to the self as a kind of schematic or formal limit, sympathetic to Kant in that way, but he also thinks it's always going to be surpassed by experience. So at times Bradley has this kind of like, he's like sort of a Kantian about the self, but it sort of is broken by a sort of Hegelian unfolding of reality sort of breaking in. So he has this kind of switch, I think, often at times. The other way that Bradley is often talked about, again, mostly by analytic commentators, is he's called the Parmenides of the 19th century. And that's a sort of legacy that's stuck and has actually come up more recently. If people know the work of Michael Della Rocca, for instance, he's written a lot about Parmenides and about a particular way of trying to rehabilitate monism, at least according to analytic philosophy, and Bradley is seen as a sort of important figure in that. Bradley is very dedicated to a sort of monistic argument, that you have to sort of deal with the one first, and that this falls into a sort of set of skeptical critiques of anything being sort of self-standing or self-grounding in relation to that oneness, right? So he's a sort of hard monist in a certain sense. And then this maybe the last point to make about Bradley before I go into some more of the conceptual details is his style and the way he writes. So again, it's a bit funny, or for someone trained in the continental tradition who sort of has trained themselves in the analytic tradition on the side, it's quite funny to read people saying Bradley is unreadable, his prose is like nonsense, all these kinds of things. And of course, if you read him, his prose is novelistic, it's almost beautiful. If anything, it's sort of like too straightforward and too pretty in a certain sense. I mean, it seems like reading William James almost, Henry James, I should say. Well, I guess William James also. And of course, there's an aversion to that, but that has to do with the history of, right, the emergence of analytic philosophy, that philosophy shouldn't be that way. And part of that too is the fact that Bradley wrote in such a way that he does not make a lot of explicit references to other philosophers, especially in his later work. So especially in his essays and Appearance and Reality, Most of the references are in footnotes. He doesn't make like long discussions about this or that philosopher's work. Though interestingly, and so I'm part of this is, I think, to be accessible, to sort of to be something that people who don't know the academic field could read. But at the same time, he's sort of hyper-referential in his essays, like things published in Mind or The Monist or something like this, to his contemporaries. So he's actually, so I think there's a real charitable thing here. He'll refer to people who are alive, basically, people who are writing the same time as him, and there's a real sense of community in his work. So he'll refer to Venn, or the sort of, he'll refer to Bergson or to James, or, people who are like exchanging with Russell with each other. So there's something interesting about that. It's not that he doesn't want to refer to any texts, for the sake of an audience, but he's also willing to do that if it's about living people. So there's something interesting, I think, in his work there. So, of course, the other thing that has to be mentioned is, the fact that Bradley became the figure to sort of assassinate, right? Because he was the figure to be overcome by Russell and Moore, right? He was because he was this capstone, the height of British idealism, when analytic philosophy came into its own, especially in the early 20th century, late 1800s, they sort of had to attack Bradley. Bradley was the person to attack. And I have this picture here. This is of Bradley's grave, which he shares with his two brothers. I actually took this photo right before visiting the archives, and actually had to pull the roots off the gravestone like some Gothic novel, because it was so uncared for, which is a bit too, almost like too on point. But soon after this, I went to the archives, and the text that I looked at in particular was Bradley's notes, his reading notes. So stuff on, him writing notes to himself based on things he read. And he read, of course, Moore's Refutation of Idealism. And right at the top of the page, there's a very funny moment when Bradley quotes Moore, and Moore says that idealism differs from the ordinary view of the world, in quotes. And so in response to this ordinary view of the world, Bradley kind of writes in brackets to himself. He says, "What's that?" Right? Like the idea of an ordinary view of the world is very question begging for Bradley, because for him, the whole point of philosophy and of idealism in particular is to question the notion of ordinary view. Like that's something that's not if Bradley goes on, the whole rest of the page is him kind of ranting about how that's not a philosophical argument, right? It's to say common sense or ordinary, those are sort of rational arguments covered as something else, right? And Bradley kind of thinks this is a bit of a cheat, essentially. And so that kind of brings us to what idealism is for Bradley, or what Bradley's doing with idealism. And here I'm very influenced by Ian Hamilton Grant, and this notion that idealism, of course, as Christopher mentioned in the opening, right, there's lots and lots of forms and varieties of idealism. And I think with Bradley, understanding that plurality is very important. And I think for him, this definition that idealism is about a realism about ideas, right? That idealism is about taking ideas and concepts seriously, right? That we can't just have a sort of scientific view of the world and then stick, idealist things or sort of conceptual things on top uncritically, right? That, in our very practical everyday life, we're constantly, confronted with the contours and limits of concepts we take to be self-evident, right? And this is something I think is very important for Bradley, right? The whole point is there's all these concepts and things we use all the time, which aren't really grounded, which have lots of limits, which are ultimately incoherent. So the point is, how do we deal with everyday life, which of course involves ethical or moral or like normative or abstract concepts? How do we get a sort of grasp of those in a satisfactory way, right? And for him, that's what idealism does. Idealism is about breaking through the sort of assumption that everything is fine, right? And so Bradley thinks, no, you sort of have to poke at these the presumed stability of certain things. And so, part of this for Bradley is this notion of feeling. And I think it strikes some people, if you read Bradley or if you read other philosophers of the time, there's a lot of talk about feeling. Like feeling is this kind of almost assumed or semi-universal concept, like as if it makes sense we can talk about these things. And I think this is part of the engagement with and difficulties with psychology. And in part because feelings, especially the way that Bradley and Whitehead use them, I think are close in some ways, but they disagree in important ways. But I think the notion of feeling is that it's the sort of thing that is later sort of chopped up or broken up into emotions, right? So feeling is the kind of like almost metaphysical or continuous sense of an experience that then becomes emotions later. And it's very evident in the fact that when Bradley speaks about feeling, he usually talks about it in terms of masses. So he'll talk about like a mass of feeling, or like he'll talk about like nebulas or clouds, right? It's kind of like chunk, that has to be, that sort of like has an effect on the thinker that the thinker has to deal with. But as soon as you chop it up or break it down, right, you're doing something, you sort of lost the effect of it in a way. And this will sort of come back later. But this idea of immediate experience for Bradley, it's not conceptual so much as it's sort of affective, or it has to do with a sort of propulsion of the immediate experience, which is only later conceptual, if that makes sense. The other thing that's really interesting about Bradley, and especially in his logic, so in the Principles of Logic, which is his, he writes some sort of shorter text, and then Principles of Logic is the first kind of big book, and then he writes the Metaphysics after, is that he's really dependent upon or really interested in this idea of the demonstrative in terms of judgments. So, and again, sort of history plays a role because, at the same time, Bradley is writing about logic in this kind of old sense, right, in terms of being about how thoughts unfurl and follow one from the other. Right? At the same time, you already have Frege and other people doing something very different, right, with logic. And so Bradley is trying to argue in the Principles that there's still something important about analyzing the way in which judgment unfurls in a kind of in a psychological, but also experiential sense. And so he really emphasizes this notion of demonstration. And he's really, again, sort of against the stereotype or the idea of him that being an absolute idealist means you sort of forego reality, whatever that means. That in fact, Bradley is very invested in frames of reference or like experience, right? Sort of experience kind of feeds into thought in this very important way. And so the demonstrative, which is this example he gives in the logic, is that when you see a bird, right, you point and say like, there's a bird, right? In terms of a judgment, that there's something that's, uncertain and incomplete about that judgment, but that being in an immediate place, being in front of the experience and also having other people around, right? And I think this is something that's implicit in a lot of Bradley's work, that there is a sort of a necessity for community, which I think is often sort of downplayed, or it's sort of in the background. Like the fact that we can agree on a judgment, we can say, yes, that's a nice yellow bird in the tree, right? Like that's sort of the meat of judgment for Bradley, really. Like that's the kind of thing that really matters. And so this goes against what would then, of course, later become a lot of the analyses of judgment. And so this gets us to the first kind of big. So I won't have lots of horribly long quotes, but this is one of them. Is this gets to this notion of regress, and of course, again, because most of the stuff written about Bradley is from analytic philosophy, and a lot of it focuses on the regresses. And there's a lot of debate in Bradley whether he has 1 or 10, or there's like lots and lots of debate about how many forms of regress there are. I think there's essentially 2. There's one in the logic and one in the metaphysics, I think. And so this is the one from the logic. And it sort of goes into this notion of judgment, right? So I'll just read the quote where he says, "We are fastened to a chain and we wish to know if we are really secure. What ought we to do? It is of much use to say this link we are tied to is certainly solid, and it is fast to the next, which seems very strong and holds firmly to the next. Beyond this, we cannot see more than a certain moderate distance, but so far as we know, it all holds together. The practical man would first of all ask, where can I find the last link of my chain? When I know that it is fast and not hung in the air, it is time enough to inspect the connection. But the chain is such that every link begets as soon as we come to it a new one. And descending in our search, at each remove, we are still no nearer the last link of all on which everything depends. And so this is the kind of external regress, right? The fact that every time you say, this is the case, and you say, why? And then if someone else says, why? I say, because of this. And they say, why? Because of this, right? And it's this kind of endless chain of justification, which is never going to have a satisfactory answer. Right? And this is why, Bradley puts, emphasis on coherence as something that's related to this demonstrative judgment, right? The fact that like when you are in a room together and you talk about something, it's just going to be good enough, right? But as soon as you're out of that context, judgments don't have any kind of real solid ground that's going to be particularly helpful, right? And so I think, this is a real problem for him. And this is a real problem for how we want to ground any kind of judgment. And so again, this is the longest longest quote I'll have in the metaphysics, right? So in Appearance and Reality, which is his metaphysical text, which comes after the Logic and is republished pretty quickly, like within 4 years, I think it's republished with a big appendix and stuff. Bradley writes this, and so this is the more famous one, and it's the one that analytic philosophers latch on to in general, and that like Russell and many other people had an issue with. So just to read it, this is from the 2nd chapter of Appearance and Reality. He says, we may take the familiar instance of a lump of sugar. This is a thing, and it has properties, adjectives which qualify it. It is, for example, white and hard and sweet. The sugar, we say, is all that. But what the is can really mean seems doubtful. A thing is not any one of its qualities. If you take that quality by itself, if sweet were the same as simply sweet, the thing would clearly be not sweet. And again, insofar as sugar is sweet, it is not white or hard, for these properties are all distinct. Nor again can the thing be all of its properties. If you take them each severally, sugar is obviously not mere whiteness, mere hardness, and mere sweetness, for its reality lies somewhere in its unity. But if, on the other hand, we inquire that what there can be in the thing besides its qualities, we are baffled once more. We can discover no real unity existing outside these qualities or again existing within them. Right. So this is this kind of internal regress, or the regress that's about like how can we talk about things or objects in any kind of coherent way, as we can decompose them seemingly infinitely, and then they don't seem to sort of be what they are, right? Without needing a kind of some sky hook or sort of bringing in some extra thing like essence or temporality or something like this, which Bradley thinks is ultimately doomed to sort of satisfy, right? And so all these things kind of connect in Bradley's work. And so, and this sort of my reading of Bradley, which I think has pretty good, I have some support, is that in a lot of the again the analytic stuff on Bradley's work, they'll try to either sort of diffuse the regress, or they'll try to say that they sort of put Bradley's theory of truth into one category. And I think that doesn't really work. And this is the sort of point about how his logic can't be separated from his metaphysics, right? And so the reason for this is that Bradley has a coherence theory of judgment, but he has an identity theory of truth, right? And so there's a lot of stuff about Bradley, and that's my claim. There's a lot of stuff about Bradley where they will say he has a correspondence theory of truth, which I don't think works. I don't think is convincing. They'll say he has an identity theory of truth in the sense that like everything fails to be the absolute, which is why there's degrees of truth. But then that's, Bradley's not sort of content with that, which is why he has this coherence theory of judgment. So the sense is that, and Robert Stern has sort of made a similar point about coherence in Bradley, that like things that hold together again with this immediate frame of reference, with sort of experience and feeling being sort of close and proximate, you can sort of cobble together enough judgments about that to make something that is more true, in a sense, right, that it appeals to be something more universal, but it has to be sort of bottom-up construction, which is always going to fail in the end. But things can be more or less true. So his theory of truth is sort of negative, and that everything fails to identify with the absolute, which is the only really true individual. But of course, that doesn't mean we can't ever say statements or make judgments about things, right? This is how these things kind of go together for Bradley. And it's also why, as I mentioned, he emphasizes demonstrative so much, right? This kind of links the two in the sense, say like that bird, right? He actually uses this example, right? That bird on the branch is over there, is very yellow or gold, right? Because it's this shared attention. There's this immediate, agreement about that. And then from that, it's sort of how far can you go from those kinds of lower level judgments? And then, he has these two forms of regress, which complicate anytime you try to extrapolate from those things. So on the one hand, the external regress, you say like, this is like this because, and that's like that because of that, and so on and so forth, right? You're constantly pushing the limits of what you can do. And then the other way, there's a sort of internal regress of saying, to say that's really a bird, you can kind of go downwards, right? And say, well, what are the qualities that make it that? And, these kinds of worries. So in one sense, some people might be surprised that Bradley is constantly talking about practical problems. His kind of pragmatic mode is because he thinks we're sort of stuck in the middle. We sort of exist in the middle between these two regresses. And the point is, how can we sort of navigate this in a meaningful way? Okay, so that's a sort of Bradley crash course. And this is in terms of relations and qualities, which hopefully it does something. And then to say why talk about Sellars and relate Sellars. I think Sellars and Bradley have a lot of things in common. Bradley hasn't had a renaissance. Sellars sort of has. But they're both sort of iconoclastic relative to their own traditions. And especially that Sellars, was writing obviously 50 or more years later about, and he's sort of an important figure in analytic philosophy, but he's also somebody who pushed against a lot of the supposed agreed upon bedrocks of analytic philosophy in a way that goes back to Bradley in many ways. And so just to sort of, he's of course mostly known, if people discuss him in terms of the myth of the given, right? And so I'll talk about this more in detail in a second. But this idea that, you can't assume that empirical experience in a direct way can give you knowledge without certain problems arising, right? And so in this sense, his critique of the so-called sense data theorists, these people in the 50s who kind of wanted to say there's kind of a direct empiricism possible, mirrors in a lot of ways the critique that British idealists had of the classical empiricists, like to say that knowledge can kind of just come immediately from impressions, jumps over a lot of hoops that it can't. And then what's also, I think, similar to Bradley, but in a different methodological way in Sellars, is this notion of meta-nominalism. So Sellars kind of says there aren't abstract entities really, but in language there are. And so the question is, how can you say language can sort of entertain these idealistic kind of fantasies that are connected to reality, but not correspondence relation, right? And so this is also where he starts to get more into Kant and Hegel and later in his life. And so the things I'll talk less about is a stereoscopic view of the human, right? That the human is kind of divided between a scientific image and a manifest image, right? The human is an organism, but it's also a cultural making, meaning, taking thing. And so Sellars wants to sort of find the language which can speak to both of those images in an important way. And again, sort of Sellars, who made these critiques and was very influential in and sort of produced a lot of important students. There was sort of a turn against him in the later 50s and 60s because he became more explicit about his Hegelian and Kantian sympathies. And he also sort of said that he thought the reality at bottom was a kind of process-based metaphysics. So he has this kind of pure process discourse, which a lot of analytic philosophers and even analytic metaphysicians thought was very strange. And they sort of were like, no, thank you, and kind of want to forget that stuff. Okay, so this is hopefully the second to last quote blob. Just to say it in terms of the myth of the given. And again, this is something I've heard so many times, but I don't know if other people have had this sort of beaten into their head as much as me. But essentially what Sellars wants to say is that you can't have a notion of direct experience, and you can't have a notion of the idea that concepts have to be learned and have those things go together in a simple way. So he has this inconsistent triad, right, where he says, a subject sensing red content non-inferentially believes or knows that X is red. 2, the ability to sense contents is inborn or natural, whatever that means. And then 3, the capacity to have classificatory beliefs or contents is learned. Right, so like that these things are red. So the whole point of Sellars is that you can have 2 of these, but not all 3, right? And so, different people argue about which ones Sellars thinks you should keep and which ones he thinks you should ditch. And so, for instance, Robert Brandom, who people probably know, says that Sellars gives up 1, right? He thinks that there is no non-inferential knowledge. But Ray Brassier, who is reading that I find much more convincing, says that Sellars gives up on 2. So I think he gives up on the fact that knowing that something is red is an inborn trait, right? And that sort of pans out in Sellars' later work because he sort of talks about how slow and complex the process is that we learn that something has a color. Right? So the real important point here and how it relates to Bradley is the idea that if you have something like raw sense experience, you can't really do much with it before submitting it to a sort of conceptual apparatus. Or if you think there's already a conceptual apparatus within experiences, then you have to say that those things aren't learned, right? So you're sort of caught in this kind of problematic situation. And I think the idea that, the ability to sense things are already a certain way, I think Bradley would also sort of reject too, but because he would say there's immediate experience in terms of feeling, but that's not sense content. It's not content in the sense of it's rationalizable. And so Bradley will often talk about this. Again, this is the sort of massive feeling, immediate experience discourse. Well, when you have an experience, you're sort of overwhelmed, you have a sort of immediate reaction to something. But as soon as you think about it, you're decomposing it, right, in a certain sense. And so I think Bradley would agree you have to learn how to do that. Right? You don't have to learn to be overwhelmed, but you have to learn to deal with being overwhelmed in that kind of sense. And so I think this is where there's an interesting relationship between the 2 of them. Just as a sort of side note, which was a bit funny to me, is that when I was writing this book on Bradley, I was initially going to have this chapter was going to be on Schelling and Bradley, and I didn't find enough connections between them to justify it. And so I ended up making it about Sellars and Bradley. And I didn't know when I started that Sellars actually references Bradley explicitly. And he does it in 2 of his later lectures, the Dewey lectures and then in the Notre Dame lectures. And it's quite funny that, or to me, it's quite funny, that Sellars uses Bradley against Russell. And so Sellars has this quote where he says that Russell tries to use Wittgenstein, as the Tractatus Wittgenstein, to sort of get around this problem of relations. And so this quote on the screen, the first lines is Russell sort of channeling Wittgenstein, and then it's Sellars' response, right? So we say that A, B stand in R by placing the expressions A, B, and R in a certain conventional triadic relation, right? So that's Wittgenstein. via Russell. And then Sellars writes, notice this way of putting things has a certain paradoxical aspect which would have warmed Bradley's heart. For in the process of telling us that we say that A and B stand in R by relating the three expressions A, B, and R, it implies that we can say the same thing by relating the four expressions A, B, R, and stand in. If the same thing is said by RAB and AB stand in R, doesn't that amount to the idea that stand in is implicit in RAB, in which case the regress is off and running? And so his point is that, Sellars' point is that he accepts the external regress, right? The sort of chain argument that Bradley has, right? That like adding words to explain relations doesn't help you. Right? It just sort of like pushes the problem down the road, but it doesn't actually address the issue of like, what is a relation? And yeah, it's something that's, I think, constantly misread. And so there's so much analytic philosophy, philosophical critiques about Bradley on these relations thing. And they'll say, oh, Bradley thinks you can't have two things next to each other. Or Bradley thinks you can't have like a city north of another city. Bradley thinks that's impossible. Even Graham Priest makes this point, and it's completely backwards, right, from what Bradley says. Bradley's whole point is, of course, you can go and look at these things and say they're like that, but when you say they're related that way, what does saying related that way add to the actual experience of seeing them like this? And this is essentially, Sellars agrees, and he proposes this weird thing called jumblies, which is a real headache if you want to look at this stuff, especially in the Naturalism and Ontology, which is the Dewey Lectures. Sellars kind of suggests, what if we had a language with no predicates, right? So instead of saying A is bigger than B, imagine you just write A really big and B really small, right? So you have this kind of diagrammatic language with no predicates. And so for Sellars, this is the only kind of strategy he thinks gets around something like Bradley's regress. Because you can't and so the whole point is that you can't, there's certain experiences or depths of experience that you can't logically cash out to such a fine degree that you will then explain them. There's some that you just have to sort of take as being experientially non-decomposable, but nonetheless, you can make judgments about, but you can't logically cash them out in the way that Russell or still lots of contemporary analytic philosophers want to do. And so this is also this sort of notorious argument, or notorious if you're Robert Brandom or some other people, this claim by Sellars about the pink ice cube, right? So he makes this argument again in his later works about the pink ice cube. And supposedly this was because he drank a lot of Aperol martinis. I don't know if that's true, but this is the rumor. So hence the picture, right? So, but then the argument that Sellars makes is he says, and this goes into this notion that experience is already conceptually laden, right? In the sense that if you see this pink ice cube, right, you see it, you have an experience of a pink ice cube, right? But he says, but you know it's not pink. You know it's not really pink because it's an effect of the lighting, it's effect of the mix of the orange and the red and, the way it's going up, right? And so part of Sellars' point is that you can have an experience of mistaking, so you can be mistaken, or you can have a misperception and you can know it, right? So you still have the experience, but you know it's a wrong experience. He also has this famous example of like a colorblind tie salesman, which is this weird example he has. But the point is, you can be aware that your perceptions are wrong and you can still have them. And that doesn't mean the perceptions are faulty exact in the same way that your knowledge of them are. And Sellars makes the point of saying that this completely is incompatible with this long-held analytic view of people like Moore and Russell, and also with the sense data theorists, that empirical data can't be wrong, right? And so this is this kind of point that Sellars is pushing on, right? That you can be mistaken but that doesn't make the experience mistaken, right? There's this gap, and this touches very much upon, right, this similar gap. I think it's a parallel gap in terms of the immediate experience of feeling and the use of that, right, and decomposed in Bradley. And so, just a sort of last slide to sort of compare and why I think there's interest here. And hopefully there's something interesting in this, but in particular, I think, and this is part of the point of the book, is to say, there's something still of use in Bradley. And I think it's the similar reasons why there's something still of use in Sellars, because they both pointed to problems that analytic philosophy in particular and pragmatism also we're going to sort of run into eventually. And that sort of cashed out in various ways in the I think 80s and 90s, by trying to keep certain problems open. And so, I won't go over again the Bradley side of things, but I think there's a sort of important correspondence, right, with Sellars that, he's also talking about inferential judgments, right, which have this kind of coherence relationship, which latch onto patterns, and patterns are sort of connected to processes, but it's not a correspondence relation, right? This dialectic between the manifest and scientific, right? The idea that reality and thought never can coincide. You can have like a better synoptic view of them, but if you coincided them, they would sort of evaporate. Bradley famously says, if you could think the absolute completely, thought would be gone. It would be thought's suicide, is the way he puts it. And this sort of, attempt to sort of talk about really local forms of demonstratives or exemplification in both cases is a way to try to deal with the limits of predication and to talk about, right, the fact that the immediate frame of reference is not a sort of trivial thing because of the experiential weight of immediate experience. And the sort of locality of judgments, that judgments and empirical experiences have a real local constraint, that troubles any attempt to sort of build a sort of straightforward rationalist character out of them. And so, I think maybe I'll stop there, if that's all right. And I hope that has, again, hopefully something interesting in all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Ben for that presentation. What we were going to do now is just kind of open it up to discussion. If you have some questions on what Ben presented, feel free to either drop them in the chat, raise your hand up. I'm just going to try to keep things organized here. Matthew Segal, I see you've kind of put some questions and comments in the chat here. I was wondering if maybe you wanted to start us off.
Sure, thanks, Ben and Ben. Really appreciated learning more about Sellars and Bradley as well. I'm a Whitehead scholar myself, and have just over the last 6 months or so started to get into F.H. Bradley, and really have been blown away by how much Whitehead borrows. So, I thought Whitehead was original, and here I find not so much, although he's doing original things with Bradley. But just in terms of what I put in the chat, I'd love to hear a bit more about Sellars' metanominalism and how you're tying his position to Bradley. Were you saying that Bradley is accurately described in those terms as well, or if not, what would the differences be there?
I think it's the relationship is that that I guess it stems from the fact that they both reject correspondence in a way. And so, but I think their strategies are different in the sense that you instead, like, in Bradley, you have something like construction towards an identity which fails. So you have like more true local coherences, which can build up towards something, like truth. Whereas I think, and in that sense, I think Bradley is maybe more Hegelian than Sellars. Whereas I would say that in that sense, Sellars is more Kantian, and that he's essentially saying, look, like we can say meaningful things, we can use abstractions in language, but they don't really exist. But he says they really exist in language, right? And so part of his whole point is to say, what does it mean to say they exist in language and they have some important relation that isn't a correspondence relationship to what he calls like real processes, or to patterns, and patterns come from real processes. So I think it's more that there's a similarity in terms of how they're both trying to get around correspondence, but basically to sort of reject simple empiricism, have this more inflated sense of empiricism, but that Bradley thinks you can kind of get to it through complicating the role of experience as feeding into thought. And I think Sellars does it in terms of like this more Kantian move of once you get into normative space, you're more detached from experience, but you can play a game there with this language reflecting on itself, and this is the Jumblees, and like you can do these experiments, which you will get a language that's more amenable to process thinking than regular language, if that makes sense. I mean, I know it's Sellars is a rough, yeah. So I think it's more about sort of how they both have this kind of makeshift or patchwork methodology towards talking about the real, but sort of I think Sellars kind of starts in the normative space, and Bradley sort of starts in this like pre-normative space, and they try to make it work, if that makes sense.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. So yeah, anybody else? Feel free to put your hand up. Maxwell, are you clapping or are you raising your hand?
I was just raising my hands.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. If you want to go ahead and ask a question, and then I have a question from Josh in the chat once you're done.
I had a quick question about, I wouldn't say it's like practical, but more just like question about like Bradley himself, because I was wondering like what's a good place to start if you haven't read Bradley? Because the thing is, I know like the analytics, for example, because they thought they gave like basically they thought like British idealism done. There's no point in studying it. There isn't like a lot of resources or like recommendations to like first go to. Like we were doing Hegel, for example, we might say, okay, easy place to start, lectures on the philosophy of history or Kant's Prolegomena.
Yeah.
But there isn't anything like that for Bradley. What would you say would be like a good, a decent place to start?
Yeah, it's true because he's not. I mean, there's. I have to look because there's a couple essays, because there's sort of later collected essays. So like the sort of last thing that's published, and there's some things in there. I would probably look in there, and it sort of depends on which topic grabs you, basically. I mean, one thing that I find, but again, this is maybe just somewhat personal taste, but there's it's like I think it's like, trying to remember the name of it. It's like the Self and World, or he has some in this sort of collected essays. There's some quite short and quite interesting texts. I'm trying to find the one. There's a sort of collected essays, and there's a collection called Essays on Truth and Reality. And I guess I would probably start with Essays on Truth and Reality, because there's things on the self, there's things on ethics, there's things, so you can kind of pick something and you'll get a sort of taste of like what he does. I think it depends a lot on temperament. It depends on like what you're into, because appearance, I read Appearance and Reality and just like read the whole thing and was like, what the hell just happened to me? But some people like throw the book against the wall after one chapter. So it really depends on your patience, especially because I would suggest Essays on Truth and Reality, because Appearance and Reality, he spends 200 pages like just trashing stuff, and then he gets to his own sort of thing. So you have to have a kind of faith that he's going to eventually say something constructive.
All right, great. Because when I Yeah, I kind of had a similar experience when I read Concept going for like the very first time. Because like it's like, okay, it's instructor text, but you get to like parts where he talks about like phenomena Newman, and you're like, what the hell is he talking about? All these weird terms, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's also him, though I'd say a different whether this is good or bad, the prolegomena, I mean, it's sort of Kant getting pissed off that he has to rewrite the Critique of Pure Reason and trying to force people to understand him, whereas Bradley didn't really care. Like, so does that make it better or worse reading? It sort of depends on, it depends on what kind of reader you are, I guess.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Max. That's
you.
a really helpful question for other folks that are interested in getting introduced to this. So Josh, I see something in here in the chat from you. Would you be interested in asking your question, or would you like me to just read it? What works best?
I can just ask it, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead. And then after Josh, I see Brother Will. So we will go there next. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of doing some research about Bradley's influence on Whitehead. And my thought about the pink ice cube example is, I guess the question is more like a confirmation of my understanding of Bradley. And in the chat, I kind of mixed up words with Whitehead and Bradley. I apologize for that, but it seems like for Bradley, probably the thought or abstraction that would be closer to reality would be that in that instance, the ice cube is pink, because that's what is happening in that period of immediate experience. And it would be an abstraction and less of a truth to say that, well, even though it's pink in that moment with my perception, that the ice cube is really clear or white. That would be an abstraction further away from reality for Bradley, I think, at least in that moment of that immediate experience.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's correct. And I think the thing, I mean, why I brought it up with Sellars, Sellars uses that example. And it's like I said, it's the thing that pisses off. Like a lot of people find it like a betrayal. And a lot of the like Brandom and McDowell and a lot of his students, like, and the Millicans and stuff, like, don't know how to deal with it. But it's kind of funny because there's been stuff written that it's basically become more and more like scientifically verifiable, in the sense that like the whole point is that if you have this he calls it this homogeneous volume, right? So again, it's this mass kind of thing. If you experience this pinkness, this blob of pinkness, and you sort of know, it's not so much that, of course, it's like if you say it's wrong, it doesn't mean that it's the whole, Sellars' point is that it's like it doesn't invalidate the experience. You're having that experience. And the reason why you're having that experience in that moment, it's going to be very hard, even if you're like a hardcore neuroscientist, to explain like what leads to the experience of that homogeneous volume of color being an experience you have then now. And, because part of the point is, and this is part of Sellars' point, is that, we learn what colors are in a very context-specific way. And it's very dependent upon the geometry of objects and, of course, the languages, right? I mean, there's been a lot written about that. So, yeah, this is why I think it's an interesting, because, yeah, the whole point is that, like, yeah, it's more true, but of course, it's more true because it's more your immediate experience for Bradley. And for Sellars, it's more true because there's a fine-grainedness to that experience, which would be very difficult to decompose, right? So yeah, it's like true for both of them, but I think for directions going in a bit, different ways.
But if you kind of view reality as a continuous whole, you can see that even like cognitive neuroscience and physiology would support the idea that the ice cube in that moment for our perception of it is pink, because the light is bending just right, and that hits our retinas, and all that continuous process of actual occasions, which eventually leads to our conscious reflection upon what color we decide to call it, involves a direct connection with that reality that caused it to appear pink.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly true. And again, this is why they both Bradley and Sellars aren't interested in correspondence, right? They're interested in like, what can you do with this?
Right.
And like, or for Sellars, how does it point to like the fact that reality is processual, not made of easily discernible individuals? So yeah, I mean, you're completely right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, yeah, great. Thanks for that question. So next up I have Brother Will. If you'd like to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask Ben your question.
Certainly. So I'm curious about heaven, and not only that, right, but the appearance of that reality which is natural that you've been speaking about, supernatural reality, appearance of that. It's in Thought and Reality, and it's on page 171, the chapter Thought and Reality of Appearance and Reality. And excuse me. Without a metaphor, feeling belongs to perfect thought, or it does not. Heaven, in brief, must either not be heaven, or else not all reality. So all of reality is heaven. Is that a way of reading that? I've always wondered that in Bradley. Certainly. That line. If we were to take all of reality, as Bradley understands it to be, as you've so presented it, certainly it's a good question, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I don't. The question of Bradley's relationship to theology is one I don't know well, I have to admit.
Not theologically speaking, but relationally speaking. If you have the copy, I have it downstairs in the library.
Yeah.
But I just pulled it up here for ease of reference. Appearance and Reality, page 171.
Yeah, I have it here too. Yeah.
Okay. It's either all of reality or not. So, thank you.
Yeah.
A very, very interesting question. I think, what do you think, Ben? Do you want some time to chew on that one? I've got a couple other people in the queue.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, like I said, I don't know the sort of that so well. And I was mostly thinking of at the end of the introduction of Appearance and Reality. He makes this kind of cryptic comment, which has always been interesting to me, where he says, where Bradley writes, you know, he says one person or another person might be more full of the divine, but there's no private road to the deity. So this is kind of like interesting comment where he says, you know, no sin is worse for the philosopher than spiritual pride. And so this is why I never quite know how to deal with this sort of talk in Bradley, to be honest, because he's much more cautious about, you know, I think he's interested in this like religious feeling or heaven, again, as this being this feeling of totality, right? I mean, as he says, right, the the feeling of immediate experience, right? This moment of experience which is overwhelming, right? He says, like, this is the closest thing we get to experiencing the absolute, even though we know it's not the absolute, right? And so I think, I mean, there's an obvious symmetry or potential symmetry there with the notion of heaven, right? The idea that there could be an experience which is, right, that, but elsewhere. But I feel like Bradley is more skeptical about the metaphysical status of that as being separate from reality than, say, you know, he's also very back and forth about souls. And also, you know, I think it's quite different from someone like McTaggart, right, who will sort of like push a sort of substance or essence to self and soul that Bradley's like not comfortable doing. I don't have a better comment than that. I have to admit.
No, that's really good. It reminds me. Our last discussion was with Sean McGraw on a different Bradley, James Bradley, who you know, kind of takes up some of this feeling stuff, but is also very interested in the notion of faith and the epistemic value of faith. So I'm wondering if perhaps that's a little intersection. Okay, great. So I have a question here from, and please forgive me if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but Alier. And Alier's microphone is not working, so I will be reading it to you. So the question is, going way back in your talk, you mentioned Bradley's novelistic style, noting this as one of the reasons his work fell out of favor. As a big fan of William James, I was wondering if you thought we might do better to see this more open literary style as an asset or strength. I was also wondering if this stylistic feature and its possibilities of expansion, ambiguity, and experimentation might be somehow connected to your upcoming work on science fiction. Thank you for that question.
Okay, well, that's a big one. Yeah, I mean, I like Bradley's style, I like the way he writes, and of course, it's not clear how much of the comments about his style were a result of simply the kind of propaganda campaign, in one way to put it, right, of the early analytics, right? The sense, because their goal, in a sense, was to make philosophy more like, you know, at least the writing in particular, more like certain aspects of the natural sciences, or even more so mathematics, right? That was the sort of model of exposition they wanted to copy. And they're pretty explicit about that, right? The propositional form being clear, you know, use of modern logic as opposed to classical logic, right? That's all stuff that's very apparent in Bradley. And there's a funny there's a quote by, I think it's by Peter Geach, sort of a bit more experimental analytic philosopher, who says, I actually quote this at the beginning of the book, where he says, like, he says, reading Bradley, I feel like I've had like a couple pints, you know, like I feel like he's like intoxicating me. And I think that's on purpose in Bradley. You know, it's not something that he always did. I think when he gets to metaphysics, I think, you know, you can like beat somebody over the head with Hegel. Or, you know, you can like write beautiful passages where you're like, you know, spoon feeding them Hegel without using any proper names. And I think that's you know, and again, like I said, it's also more accessible, because even if you don't know the names and stuff, even the appearance of lots of formal names or jargon, right? The absence of that, even the absence of that gives a sense of like trust, or as a sense of like, look, I'm trying to like take you into this like world. And so I think that is very, I think that's something that I would like there to be more of. I think that's a good thing. I don't mean to knock it. I just say that like it was attacked because I think it was an easy way to attack him. But then in terms of the current thing, or the book I'm sort of finishing now, which is like on a totally different, or I should say the sort of connection between science fiction, colonialism, and then the stuff on Bradley, is the time period and the sense of like, you know, the third wave of colonialism, industrial revolution, right? That is sort of the emergence of science fiction. And I think that time I think that time period, right, the sort of 1850, to sort of early 1900s is, again, in this period where so much stuff emerges, and it emerges from trying to integrate the natural sciences and the humanities on one level. And then once you get to like the 1920s and 1930s, you get that's abandoned, right? There's sort of a sense of like, okay, no, the humanities are the humanities and the sciences are the sciences. And, you get Husserl, right? You get like there's more attempt to sort of bracket and protect the humanities from the sciences. And so I think the fact that science fiction emerges in this period when there's a lot of attempts to make a metaphysics that can include mind and science without being reductive, I think is very telling. It's not surprising that then science fiction comes out of that, right? The fact that you have, you have people who don't agree on anything sitting around the same table in a pub in London reading Spinoza, right? Having like George Eliot translating Spinoza, George Lewes writing about Spinoza and Goethe, and then having Herbert Spencer hanging out there, they hate each other's politics, but yet, right, this notion of how to put mind into nature and then pull it back out in a non-reductive way also gives birth to science fiction, and I think that's not a coincidence.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much. All right, Eric, I think I have you up, and then a couple more people. And I think we're going to try to close around 4:30. So if you're not able to get your questions in, I'm sure we'll be able to continue some of this with Ben at some other point. But yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for that talk. And I'm not super familiar with Bradley, but I am interested in qualities and relations, especially in Charles Peirce. But I had a question. Maybe you can just comment on this or clarify for me. So in Appearance and Reality, Bradley makes something that has been called a kind of third man argument, where and my understanding is that he did this to prove that relations are mere appearances, that there aren't real things called relations. And so it's the idea of this regress, right? If A and B stand in relation C, then you kind of have to go back, well, what is C? What does C stand in? And you kind of, then they must, relation D. And there's an infinite kind of regress there. And you end up with the conclusion that there's no relation because of this, that it outside of appearance. And, like Frege and Russell worried about this a lot because it implied that you can't, analyze a proposition down to its, like you can't find the unity of the proposition.
Yeah.
Peirce's solution is a bit strange. He kind of begins with Russell, but he is kind of a realist towards relations. So he sees that when you get to that point where you have a continuous predicate, like you keep breaking the proposition down more and more, and you're not really getting any new things coming out of it. You've kind of exhausted, and you just end up with this infinite regress. And he derives the unity of the proposition actually from that, because it's a real relation. He's a realist towards those sorts of things. But I mean, maybe you could just comment on this relations being mere appearances only and not things.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess the part of the thing to say is that there's sometimes and again, I think it's in a lot of the analytic literature in particular, there's a sense that when Bradley says something is appearance, therefore it's like bullshit, right? Which isn't really, which is not really his point. His point is saying, like, to say something is real for him. And this is why I also compare him to Sellars, right? If you say something is only linguistic or something is only practical, right? That doesn't mean it's like less important. It's like necessary, actually. So appearances are necessary for Bradley. You can't do anything without appearances, right? It's really clear. But what Bradley sort of, the point of that regress, at least in Appearance and Reality, is more, and of course it's part of a long series of these critiques, is that he's saying you can't say, you can't say relations are things. in the sense that, which doesn't mean that you can talk about if something is related to something else for Bradley, right? You're pointing to a certain like aspect of the absolute, but that aspect is only really going to carry weight based on how you talk about it with other people in a practical situation, right? So you say like, and this is missed a lot, I think, by critics, like even Graham Priest, who, you know, he has this thing, I can't remember if it's in one or if it's in which text it's in, but he says this thing where Bradley thinks like, Bradley doesn't, you know, denies that like, you know, this city is north of this city or something like this. And again, like, as I mentioned, like that's not the case. Bradley's question is, what does saying they're related add to the experiential proof of a judgment about their location? Right. So the question is like, what does relation add to that? Right. So it's not that their relations don't point to something that's really like a part of reality. But it's that, you know, it's also that I think Bradley sort of thinks there's, you know, the absolute is a sort of structure, but anytime you talk about the parts of it, you're breaking it down, right? Like in a way that doesn't actually do justice to the absolute. Doesn't mean it isn't useful, but you can't say like relations are or relations exist. Like that doesn't mean anything for Bradley. He's like, what is, you know, he thinks you're trying to basically justify things you're going to say before you actually have to say them. Right. In a sense, Bradley, by doing this, Bradley's always saying, what's the context? What's the frame of reference? You know, where I think the critiques of a lot of people make is they think like, oh, Bradley thinks unless it's about the absolute, it doesn't matter. Right. And his point is like, no, the point is you're absolutizing thing by saying a relation. And he's like, but what do you mean? Right. So I think he's actually like super contextualist, basically. I mean, I don't know if that's satisfactory, but I think that's what I think, you know, it's about the burden of proof. And he's sort of putting it, and he's trying to reverse it that way. Right. So it's like, what's the experience of those things being the way you say they are, which of course is going to fall away. Right. So to say like, those people are related, you know, Bradley would say, okay, you know, like what? But like, there's no content to that sentence really, because, you know, say the thing you mean to say, right? So I think this is sort of, I think he's wary of it standing on its own as a persuasive or as a thing or as an object, of course, but also as a sort of pragmatic, you know, foundationalist or kind of unquestionable token, right? I think he's like, well, but what does that actually mean when you say that?
All right, thank you for that response, Ben. Paulo, I heard a rumor that you have a question. Did you want to hop off mute?
Rumor.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many puzzling elements of Bradley that I would love to get Ben's comments on. I mean, you've been speaking a bit about the absolute right now, and I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on some puzzling things Bradley says about it. At the end of chapter 15 of Appearance and Reality, he says, the absolute is something we don't know in detail, but know in general. And as far as I know, that is the only time Bradley introduces this distinction of some kind of two forms of knowledge or two forms of intelligibility between it being detailed and it being general. It seems like a bit of an ad hoc move at that point of the book. And you might think, you know, critics of Bradley might think that that's the point at which you modus tollens the modus ponens, but, you know, Bradley modus ponens and says, well, okay, no, there's this distinction between the kind of intelligibility of the absolute and the kind of intelligibility of things that are sort of about the absolute. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oof. Yeah, I mean, it's, I mean, I think that's sort of why in the first chapter of my book, I sort of struggle with this whole notion of, you know, that because the absolute is, and we have a sort of sense of it, right? So there's this kind of like feeling connection to it. What becomes difficult for me, and I still struggle with this, is how, because that you have sort of this non-conceptual experience of unity. Right? So you think of like the feeling you have when you walk into the house you grew up in, like what's the first second, what happens to your brain, you know? in the sense of like all these things are out of temporal order, like stuff is, you know, all this kind of massive experience. And then the question, yeah, which I struggle with, which I think that points to, is then you sort of say, okay, you then know that other experiences you have or other things you encounter fail to meet that criterion of feeling. And so then, of course, you have to speculate. And this is this like famous line he has, I think, which I think is in the introduction to Appearance and Reality, if I remember, or it's one of the pithy sayings that's always quoted, right? Which says like metaphysics is like the finding of bad reason. You know, it's like metaphysics is like a bad instinct, but it's still an instinct, right? This kind of thing. So I think that plays into that. The fact is like we like feel like we need metaphysics because we need like the game board to exist by which we can put all these feelings and experiences and time out of order and all this stuff. But then of course, then, and you can sort of say there's then collective judgments about things that are more or less like that, right? But then, yeah, I struggle with, I think the really difficult thing, which I think is in that quote you point to, is like, what's the difference between like 95% and 99%? You know, there's this kind of problem of like, is there a shift in type of knowledge eventually, like from experiential knowledge to something like rational knowledge, which I don't think he would like.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff is where it seems like where the people who want to read Bradley as a mystic, they point to those kind of passages.
Yeah.
And those are the things that sort of trouble me. I'm like, there has to be, there are other places where it's clearly Bradley is not a mystic. And yet he says these things.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's really difficult because, and I think that's why so much in the book, you know, I sort of connect him to various, you know, more contemporary thinkers. And then I feel like there's so many ways where he's like the late Wittgenstein, or he's like even like Stanley Cavell, or these kind of analytic philosophers who kind of say like, yeah, there's no easy way to map language onto thought. There always has to be more room. So in a sense, yeah, I think that's the difficult thing, in the sense of like, so much of the time when you read Bradley, the absolute is a heuristic of like non-closure, like non-totality. And there's other times when, but then of course, because he says that's kind of this like instinct, he says that's kind of like a primal thought, it's almost like, but is that actually metaphysically true? You know, and I don't know. And I think it's really telling that he and I talk about this in the chapter, he pulls a lot from a particular section of Hegel's philosophy of mind, but he kind of rewrites it in the sense of basically he thinks that Hegel jumps away from feeling to reason too quickly. And Bradley essentially sticks with the feeling part in terms of the development of consciousness and says, no, we actually never get away from that. And so when you think about that, it's sort of, to me, that's the problem. And the problem is, it's almost like, I don't want to say he's being mystical or whatever, but it's almost like the positing of the absolute is like a genetic superstition, you know, or it almost has this feeling sometimes, and I really don't know what to do with that. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a good response, but it's a tough one for me.
Okay, well, I think I have one last question here for you. Aaliyah, are you able to jump off mute, or would you like me to read your question? If you'd like me to read it, just don't respond.
No, I can jump on.
There we go. All right, excellent. Take it away.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? All right, cool. So I guess, I don't know. Well, first of all, thanks for everything, because this has been great. I've really enjoyed this. I will say I don't really know a whole lot about Bradley. I've heard great things, but I haven't really had a chance to read any of this stuff. But one of the things that really jumped out at me through this whole thing was when you were talking about like our position in this like ascendant chain. And that to me, like, you know, so if we have this like this fullness of experience, which then we can really only start to make sense of when we kind of like descend into concepts, but then we, you know, get away from that fullness when we do that. It reminds me of how Lacan talks about like the signified being something that we can't really reach. And then because of that, you know, we have to like kind of descend into signifiers that never really get there, but they're kind of what we have to work with. And he talks about that being like a signifying chain. It's kind of like, so it's all happening it's all relational, the signifying chain, but it never ends. Like there's never an end to the chain. And I was just wondering if you were able to like kind of draw out any, connections that are here or any distinctions as well. Like if you could, I don't know, if you're able to talk about that at all. And if not, that's okay. I was just curious if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks. I mean, there's definitely, the sort of signifying chain thing, of course. Yeah, it's hard not to sort of hear that when you, if you know Lacan. I think, actually thought about if there's interesting connections to Lacan and Bradley. I think it probably has to do with how they talk about the limits of the self, and which I think, of course, which relates to this in a way, because especially towards the end of his life, some of the last things that Bradley writes about is he's really concerned with the idea of the world and my world. And I think there's something very relevant to psychoanalysis, because he's essentially like worried about fantasy. He's, in terms of like the phantasmatic space is like kind of worrying him. And he even talks about this novel, I can't remember the name of the novel, but it's about a priest who's a vampire. It's like a strange moment where Bradley talks about this, but he kind of goes on about it, and then he says, how do I know, like, I read this novel and I have these desires and like I have this whole like inward like imaginative space, and this means more to me than the outside world, right? And so, and this is it's one of the last texts he writes, actually, which is like, how do I deal with this fact? And so I think there's something there's probably something there, in the sense that that's probably where Bradley is dissatisfied with Kant. This notion of the self as being kind of even formally closed. The closure doesn't really work, because you're sort of, even if you're in that phantasmatic space, you encounter some resistance, right? Or something happens in the world, and like the formation of your desires becomes, glommed onto something you didn't expect. And so I think, and that's where the probably passage to Hegel takes place. But yeah, I don't know if I have anything too interesting to say, but I mean, I think it's, I don't think he really talks about, I guess because of the time period, he doesn't really talk about Freud, but he engages a lot with psychology and with the sort of, especially like Wundt and these people like Meinong and the people who were talking about the kind of irreducible kind of aspects of consciousness. And I think, I almost feel like Bradley has a very processual notion of the self, but then at the end of his life, he starts to have these concerns that almost make him sound more like Lacan, like about this sticking point suddenly becomes a problem. And then he kind of goes back to this discussion of language. So I don't know, maybe that's helpful, but yeah, thanks.
All right, great. Well,
yeah, thank you. That was actually awesome. That was just what I was looking for. So I'll have to read that as well, the novel you're talking about, and kind of look into that more myself. Thanks for your response. That was great.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's about all the time we have. So if folks want to show a little digital love and appreciation to Ben Woodard for joining us here, really appreciate it. So just a couple quick notes. If you are interested in getting more information about upcoming talks and events from the Idealist Society of North America, just send us an email to it's Idealist Society of North America @gmail.com. On Twitter, you can follow us at Idealist SOCNA. That's our Twitter handle. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Chris. I think I got that right.
You got it right.
All right, excellent. And on behalf of Paulo, Chris, myself, and Yasmin, we'd all like to thank you. Speaking of Yasmin, who's not here, we now have a website that's up. Do you know the URL for that off the top of your head, Chris?
I think it's just idealistsocietyofnorthamerica.com.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, and then on there, there will be a link to this video. There's also going to be a link there to the event that we had with Dr. Sean McGraw. And yeah, we'd all just really like to thank you for showing up. And yeah, thank you, Ben, for your time.
Yeah, thank you for all the questions. So,
all right, excellent. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening.